On a gray morning in October 1974, the town of Silver Falls, Oregon, woke to the sound of church bells, not for a wedding or service, but for the disappearance of a 17-year-old girl named Lydia Roan. She'd been seen the night before at the Silver Falls Harvest Fair, laughing with friends, holding a caramel apple, her denim jacket marked with a small stitched daisy. At 9:42 p.m., she told her best friend she was walking home before curfew. She lived less than a mile away. She never arrived. By sunrise, her bicycle was found lying in a ditch along Route 17, its front wheel still spinning. Her purse was hanging from the handlebar, her wallet untouched. And beneath the handlebars, pressed faintly into the metal, a single bloody fingerprint. It wouldn't mean anything for almost 50 years. The first days of the search were chaos. Hundreds of volunteers, state troopers, even logging crews joined in. They scoured the forests and riverbanks, shouting her name into the fog. For 3 weeks, nothing. Then, a hunter found a torn piece of denim fabric near the base of a cedar tree, the same pattern as Lydia's jacket. Detective Frank Dalton, a local veteran investigator, led the case. He was methodical, calm, and deeply superstitious. He believed, as he told reporters later, the truth always leaves a mark. But in 1974, that mark, the fingerprint, led nowhere. The town didn't have the technology or resources to analyze partial prints. The Oregon Bureau of Investigation logged it as unidentifiable. The file went cold by Christmas. Over the years, the case became legend. Parents used Lydia's name as a warning. Don't walk home alone after dark like that Roan girl. Her classmates left flowers every October at the spot where her bicycle was found. Her parents moved away in 1978, unable to drive past the ditch that had swallowed their lives. Detective Dalton never closed the file. He kept the evidence box in his office until the day he retired. "That print bothers me," he'd mutter. "It's like the story wants to tell itself but can't find the right voice." When he died in 2003, his daughter donated his notes and evidence to the Silver Falls Police Department. They stored the box in a dusty evidence room, forgotten, like Lydia. In 2022, Silver Falls was a different place. The sawmills were gone, replaced by coffee shops and art galleries. Most people had never heard of the Roan case, but one detective, Rachel Monroe, did. She'd grown up in the area and remembered her grandmother's stories about the girl in the woods. When Oregon launched a statewide DNA and fingerprint reanalysis initiative, Monroe submitted the Roan evidence box as a long shot. Inside, the old partial fingerprint, photographed but never digitally processed, was uploaded into the AFIS National Fingerprint Database. 2 weeks later, her phone rang. "Detective Monroe, we got a match." The print matched a deceased man named Thomas Avery, a former volunteer firefighter who had lived in Silver Falls in the 1970s. Avery had died in 1999, natural causes, no criminal record. But his name wasn't what shocked Monroe. It was the location. Avery had lived directly across the street from the Roan family. The town didn't take the news easily. Thomas Avery had been a respected man, Sunday school teacher, volunteer firefighter, even led town parades. He was the one who'd helped organize Lydia's search party. When Monroe told his widow, Margaret, she went pale. "Tom? No," she whispered. "He loved that girl. He cried when she went missing." But the fingerprint didn't lie. It was Lydia's blood, and it was his print. A search warrant on the Avery estate revealed something disturbing. Hidden in the attic were 3 sealed cardboard boxes labeled 1974. Inside were dozens of old photographs, faded, not, some damaged, of children at school events, parades, and parks. Most were innocent, but a few showed Lydia. Close-ups, candid, taken without her knowledge. And beneath them, a small silver locket engraved with her initials, LR. Monroe called in forensics. DNA swabs from inside the locket matched Lydia's remains, which had been found decades earlier, in 1980, but never positively identified due to degradation. The remains were buried in an unmarked grave 30 miles south under the name Jane Doe 12. The revelation sent shockwaves through Oregon. The case that haunted a generation was suddenly solved, not by confession, not by chance, but by a single fingerprint that had waited half a century for someone to listen. Still, Monroe couldn't shake one detail: the location of the body. It was found near an old fire road only someone local would know about. And the coroner's report from 1980 mentioned something strange: traces of gasoline residue on the remains, even though there had been no fire. Why would a firefighter leave that behind? She reopened the investigation into Avery's past. What she found was darker than anyone expected. In 1973, 1 year before Lydia's disappearance, a small shed behind the Avery property caught fire. The official report called it an accident, but Dalton's handwritten notes in the 1974 file told another story. Witnesses saw Avery arguing with Lydia's father that week. About what? No one knew. Lydia's father had worked for the fire department too, briefly. He was dismissed in 1973 for internal misconduct, though no details were ever made public. When Monroe tracked down old employment records, she found a sealed disciplinary file. Inside, a single note written in the chief's handwriting: conflict with Avery over family matters. Recommend immediate termination. Suddenly, everything fit. Avery's obsession with Lydia wasn't random. It was revenge. He'd wanted to hurt the man who humiliated him by taking the one person he loved most. As the story broke statewide, Silver Falls split in two. Some refused to believe it. Others said it explained everything. Reporters camped outside the Avery home until Margaret moved away. She left behind only one statement: if he did it, he's been burning in hell a long time already. Detective Monroe stood at the site where Lydia's bicycle was found, now overgrown with wild grass. She placed a single daisy on the spot. The town had turned its horror into a memorial park years before, never realizing it was a crime scene. In a local interview, Monroe said softly, "All these years, the answer was sitting on a handlebar. Sometimes justice isn't buried, it's just ignored." Later that year, during an evidence audit, Monroe discovered one final surprise inside the Avery box: a folded piece of paper tucked under the lining. It was a letter written in 1975, never mailed. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible. "They think I'm a hero for helping. If only they knew what I really saved from the fire." No signature, but the handwriting matched Thomas Avery's. The line would haunt Monroe for the rest of her life. When the Oregon Bureau of Investigation officially closed the file, Lydia's remains were reburied under her real name. Hundreds attended the ceremony. Her childhood friends, now gray-haired, stood beside her family's old pastor. As the coffin was lowered, he said, "One fingerprint told the truth that time refused to forget." Monroe watched quietly, rain falling around her. Later, she said in an interview, "The past doesn't stay silent. It waits for science to learn how to listen. Sometimes the smallest evidence carries the loudest voice." A fingerprint, pressed in panic, left on a bicycle, exposed a secret a whole town buried for nearly 50 years. Silver Falls will never forget Lydia Roan, because sometimes justice doesn't come from the living. It comes from the mark they leave behind. When the news broke that Thomas Avery, the town's own volunteer hero, had been the man behind the Lydia Roan murder, Silver Falls came apart like a dam cracking under years of pressure. Reporters swarmed the old mill town, digging into anything they could find about the quiet firefighter who'd once led the town's parades. People couldn't reconcile the images in their minds. Avery helping search for Lydia in 1974, holding a flashlight beside her father, and the Avery who'd left his fingerprint in her blood. The contradiction tore through the community like wildfire. At the diner on Main Street, a group of retirees who'd known him for decades sat in stunned silence. One of them, a man named Rick Danner, finally said what everyone else was afraid to. "We didn't miss the truth. We just didn't want to see it." Detective Rachel Monroe had heard that same sentiment over and over since reopening the case. In interviews, people used words like shocked, betrayed, disbelieving. But beneath the surface, she sensed something else: guilt. Because in 1974, Thomas Avery wasn't a stranger. He was the man everyone trusted. The state attorney general's office ordered a full inquiry into Avery's history. The fingerprint had solved the case, but the details of how it had stayed hidden for 50 years exposed deep failures. Dalton, the original investigator, had filed his suspicions about Avery in 1975. His notes, long buried in handwritten journals, showed that he'd tried to have the fingerprint reanalyzed twice. In the early 1980s, both requests were denied due to budget limitations. Even more damning, a memo in the old county archive revealed that Avery himself had worked as a temporary evidence clerk for 6 months after the case went cold. He'd had full access to the evidence locker, including Lydia's bicycle. Monroe read that line 3 times before whispering he was protecting his own fingerprint. When she presented her findings at the press conference, she didn't mince words. This was not just a failure of technology, it was a failure of trust. Avery hid in plain sight because no one thought a helpful man could also be a killer. Her statement became front-page news statewide. Other towns began reopening their unsolved cases, wondering how many helpful men had slipped through the same cracks. Within weeks, 2 other Oregon cold cases were linked to Avery's movements in the 1970s. Both victims were young girls. Both vanished under similar circumstances. Both lived within 20 miles of fire stations where Avery volunteered part-time. The first was Emily Peters, age 15, missing since 1972. The second, Carrie Lowe, age 14, disappeared in 1975, just 1 year after Lydia. Old witness statements described a man in a fire truck seen talking to both girls before they vanished. The descriptions matched Avery almost perfectly. Tall, sandy hair, soft voice, polite smile. When Monroe received that report, she stared at it for a long time. She already knew what the truth was, but she wanted science to confirm it. DNA samples from both cases were resubmitted for testing using touch trace methods that hadn't existed back then. 8 weeks later, the lab confirmed it. The same genetic trace found on Lydia's locket appeared on a shoelace recovered from the 1975 case. Avery wasn't just Silver Falls' secret. He was Oregon's. The revelation hit the community like a second wave of grief. The same people who defended Avery now publicly apologized. One woman who'd gone to church with him for 20 years told reporters, "He baptized my daughter. He stood in our kitchen. I can't stop thinking about his hands. Those were the same hands that killed that girl." For Monroe, it was hard not to think of how close the case had come to vanishing forever. If the state initiative hadn't launched, if she hadn't been curious enough to reopen Dalton's box, Lydia's name might have remained a ghost story. She often said the case changed her understanding of time itself. "People think cold cases are frozen," she told a journalist later. "They're not. They're still moving. You just can't see it until the right moment." In January 2023, Oregon's governor announced a new law named the Roan Act, requiring mandatory preservation of all physical evidence in homicide and missing person cases, indefinitely. It was the first of its kind in the state. The bill's tagline came directly from Dalton's old quote, "The truth always leaves a mark." Monroe was invited to the signing. She didn't make a speech. She simply placed a small daisy on the governor's desk beside the pen. "For Lydia," she whispered. But the case wasn't quite done with her. That spring, while digitizing the Avery photos, forensic technicians discovered something no one expected: an undeveloped roll of film in one of the boxes from his attic. When processed, the negative showed a hidden side of Avery's obsession. There were photographs of Lydia at school, in the library, walking home, all taken from a distance. But the final frame froze Monroe cold. It showed a young girl she didn't recognize, blonde, no older than 14, standing near a riverbank. The timestamp read 1976, 2 years after Lydia's death. There were no records of missing persons from that area that year. No complaints, no known victims. Whoever the girl was, she'd never been reported missing. The image raised an awful possibility. Avery may have taken more than the 3 cases linked by DNA. There could be others that no one even knew about. Monroe turned the photo over in her hands and said quietly to herself, "How many fingerprints are still waiting?" The photo was sent to the FBI's cold case database for facial recognition. Months later, analysts matched the girl's face to a childhood portrait of a woman named Sandra Avery, Thomas's own niece. She had disappeared from public records in 1977 when her family relocated to Idaho. Interviews revealed she'd run away as a teenager and lived under a different name for years. When contacted, she confirmed she was alive, but she refused to talk about her uncle. All she said was, "He liked to take pictures of people when they didn't know." Her tone made it clear that the family had long suspected something was wrong. By late 2023, Silver Falls was rebuilding its reputation, but the scars stayed visible. The park where Lydia's bicycle was found was renamed Roan Meadow with a plaque that read, "Discovered by truth, remembered by time." Visitors often left flowers, daisies, always daisies. Some came to honor her. Others came to remind themselves that evil doesn't always look like a monster. Detective Monroe continued her work, though colleagues noticed she'd grown quieter. When asked why she never took credit for solving Oregon's oldest active case, she said, "I didn't solve it. Lydia did. She left her own fingerprint. All I did was look closely enough to see it." That December, an anonymous donor sent a small box to the Silver Falls Police Department. Inside was a folded note and a tarnished firefighter badge with Avery's initials scratched out. The note read, "Every hero leaves a secret behind. You found mine." The handwriting was unmistakably Margaret Avery's. She had died just weeks earlier. No one ever learned where she'd found the badge or why she'd kept it. At the 50th anniversary memorial for Lydia's disappearance in 2024, Monroe stood beside the crowd as rain fell softly on the park. The town's mayor read the same line carved on her plaque, and for a moment, the entire place went silent. Monroe later said that in that silence, she felt something shift. Not closure, not forgiveness, but peace. The truth didn't bring the town back together, she said. It just made sure we finally stopped lying to ourselves. She placed her hand on the plaque, her reflection blurred in the wet metal. "The fingerprint was Lydia's last word," she whispered, and the world finally heard it. The rain never really left Silver Falls after the case closed. It became part of the town's rhythm, soft, constant, a reminder that nature has its own way of washing memory clean without erasing it. For Detective Rachel Monroe, it was the sound that marked the end of every shift and the start of every reflection. In the months following the Lydia Roan revelation, Silver Falls changed. The town's once quiet streets turned into memorial sites. The library hosted lectures about the importance of preserving evidence. The high school named its new forensic program after Lydia. Every October, students placed fresh daisies near the trail where her bicycle was found. a line of white petals leading toward the woods. For Monroe, though, the case wouldn't let go. Even after the state closed the file and the nation moved on, something in Dalton's notes kept whispering to her. The old investigator's voice, echoing from another decade. He'd written, "The truth always leaves a mark." But beneath that, in faded pencil, he'd added something she hadn't noticed before. Some marks are made by the ones trying to uncover it. She didn't understand what he meant. Not until she found his last journal. It was discovered in 2024, during an inventory of the old Silver Falls station, hidden in a false drawer inside Dalton's desk, wrapped in newspaper from 1979. The first page was dated January 3rd, 1975, 2 months after Lydia disappeared. The entry read, "The Avery man helped us search again today. He's everywhere. Too eager. I've told the chief, but he says not to scare the town. I can't shake the feeling I've shaken hands with the killer." The next few pages were routine observations, interviews, false leads, weather notes. But midway through, the handwriting changed, sloppier, rushed, something strange. Bicycle moved, print wiped down, but faint ridge still visible. Someone tried to clean it, not realizing blood leaves its own memory. Took the photo myself to preserve it, keeping copy off record. Beneath the entry, a taped photograph, the original image of the fingerprint before it was logged. Dalton had secretly preserved the evidence in his personal files, ensuring that Avery's attempt to erase it failed. Monroe realized that the print she'd matched in 2022 wasn't just Lydia's final plea. It was also Dalton's silent defiance. He'd left his own mark alongside hers. He'd known, even back then, that the killer was closer than anyone dared to believe. When she brought the discovery to the state archives, the director called it the missing link between 2 generations of justice. Monroe just called it proof that ghosts keep good company. She arranged for Dalton's journal to be placed beside Lydia's bicycle in the Oregon Justice Museum. On the display plaque, she requested a single quote engraved from his first entry. "The truth doesn't fade, people do." A few months later, Monroe moved to Portland, taking a position as an instructor in forensic analysis. Her lectures were quiet, deliberate, and heavy with experience. She never mentioned Silver Falls by name, but her students always knew when she was talking about it. The smallest things, she'd tell them, decide whether a story ends or continues. A print, a fiber, a photograph. They're the last things people leave behind when they're silenced. Her students later said she spoke like someone haunted, but grateful. Back in Silver Falls, a local journalist began compiling a book on the Roan case. During research, she uncovered a small recording of Dalton's retirement interview from 1992. His voice, crackly on tape, said, "They tell me to let it go, but some cases aren't supposed to let go. Some are meant to follow us, to make sure we do better next time." The quote became the opening line of the book, A Fingerprint of Fire, which became a national bestseller. Its final chapter closed with Monroe's note, "Justice doesn't always come from miracles or confessions. Sometimes, it's one detective in the past saving a clue for another detective in the future. That's what truth really is, a chain that refuses to break." In 2025, the Rowan Act went federal, adopted as a model for digital cold case preservation nationwide. Dalton and Monroe's names appeared in the bill's dedication. The president signed it with the same line from the memorial plaque, "The truth always leaves a mark." That spring, Silver Falls hosted a ceremony in the park that now bore Lydia's name. A statue of a bicycle wheel, rising from stone, stood at its center, surrounded by daisies cast in bronze. Monroe returned one last time, older now, her hair streaked with gray. She stood alone as rain began to fall, tracing her fingers over the carved letters, Lydia Roan, 1957 to 1974. She left her fingerprint on the world, and the world found her again. She whispered, "We kept our promise." As she turned to leave, A gust of wind scattered leaves across the ground. One caught her boot, an old, weathered scrap of paper lifted from the grass. It was from Dalton's journal, torn loose during the transfer to the museum. The writing on it read, "Justice is just memory that refuses to die." Monroe smiled, folded the note, and slipped it into her coat pocket. That night, she wrote her final case report. It wasn't for the state, or the press, or the museum. It was for herself. "I used to think evidence was about solving crimes. It's not. It's about giving the voiceless a second life." Lydia spoke through a fingerprint, and that was enough. One print, one truth, one town that finally stopped pretending it was innocent. She closed the file, sealed it with a small wax stamp, and locked it in her drawer. Outside, the rain slowed. The clouds began to break, and for the first time in 50 years, Silver Falls felt lighter. Months later, visitors to the Oregon Justice Museum noticed something new beside Lydia's display: a framed photograph of Detective Monroe and Dalton standing side by side, digitally recreated from two different decades, one black and white, one color. The caption beneath read, "Two detectives, one fingerprint, 50 years of waiting." In the end, Lydia's story became a symbol across America, a reminder that no secret, no matter how long it's buried, stays hidden forever. Silver Falls rebuilt itself not by forgetting, but by remembering. The fingerprint that once haunted a bicycle handlebar became the most important clue in Oregon's history. Not because of what it revealed, but because of what it proved. That time doesn't erase truth. It just waits for someone brave enough to touch it again.